Hello everybody, welcome to Daily News Simplified, an answer to what, why and how of newspaper reading. Today we shall be analyzing the Hindu newspaper dated 9th of Jan 2019 of the New Delhi edition. The topics to be discussed today has been presented on your screen. Timestamping for the same has been provided in the description box below. Let us begin our today's discussion. Now this particular article appears as a lead article on page number 8. The title of the article is A Renewed Attack on Privacy. This article shall be important from the perspective of GS Paper 2 Governance under the subsection Government Policies and Interventions. Before analyzing this particular article, let us first look into its background. In a historic case known as the Puttaswamy vs. Union of India, the Supreme Court had declared that the right to privacy shall be a fundamental right in India. Subsequently, a bunch of petitions were filed before the Supreme Court wherein the petitioners had argued that since Aadhaar entails a collection of biometric data, it would lead to creation of a surveillance state and hence it impinges on the fundamental right of privacy. However, in the Aadhaar case, the Supreme Court has upheld the constitutional validity of Aadhaar. This is because the Supreme Court was of an opinion that Aadhaar strikes a fine balance between the fundamental right to privacy and the right to life. This is because by using Aadhaar, the citizens in India will be able to get various kind of benefits from the government such as subsidies. And at the same time, the Supreme Court also imposed certain restrictions on the use of Aadhaar, wherein Supreme Court struck down Section 57 of the Aadhaar Act as unconstitutional. It is to be noted here that Section 57 enabled the companies such as banks as well as the telecom operators to use Aadhaar for linking it to mobile phones and bank accounts. Now to know about the Supreme Court judgment on Aadhaar, I suggest you to go through our DNS dated 27th of September 2018, wherein we have comprehensively covered the various aspects of the Supreme Court judgment on use of Aadhaar. Now subsequent to the Supreme Court judgment, recently the Lok Sabha has passed the Aadhaar and Other Laws Amendment Bill 2018. Now this particular amendment basically seeks to provide for the voluntary sharing of the Aadhaar details by the citizens with banks and telecom operators, which means to say that the sharing of Aadhaar details with the banks and telecom operators shall be voluntary and not mandatory, wherein the citizens would decide whether they would want to share their Aadhaar details with the banks and telecom operators. Now this particular article here has highlighted certain concerns with respect to the bill passed by the Lok Sabha, wherein it has highlighted that the bill flouts both the constitution as well as the Supreme Court judgment with respect to Aadhaar. So this particular article says that the voluntary sharing of the Aadhaar details with banks and telecom operators goes against the Supreme Court judgment on Aadhaar and also violates the fundamental right to privacy of the individuals. Hence, as part of this video analysis, we shall basically emphasize on 3 points. Firstly, we'll understand as to what exactly is Section 57 of the Aadhaar Act and why this Section 57 has been declared as unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. And thirdly, we'll look into certain concerns raised in this particular article with respect to the current amendment bill passed by the Lok Sabha. So let us start our analysis with Section 57 and why this section has been declared as unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. Now coming to Section 57 of the Aadhaar Act. Now under Section 57, companies such as banks, telecommunication companies as well as the e-commerce companies can ask for Aadhaar details from an individual in order to establish his identity, wherein the Aadhaar details can be linked to bank accounts and the mobile number. Now the Supreme Court of India struck down Section 57 of the Aadhaar Act mainly on 2 grounds. Firstly, it believed that enabling the companies to collect the Aadhaar details would lead to a creation of a surveillance state. Now what this essentially means is if the companies in India are using the Aadhaar details in order to authenticate the identity of a person, such companies will be able to track the movement of the people, they will be able to assess their habits, and based upon their habits, these companies can use the Aadhaar details in order to influence the behavior of the people, which means that the people in India would be on an electronic leash if their Aadhaar details are available to the companies in India. And this goes against the fundamental right to privacy. Secondly, the Supreme Court believed that Section 57 of the Aadhaar Act would enable the companies to commercially exploit the user data. And this becomes important because presently there is no comprehensive law which provides for the data privacy in India. And in absence of such a law, it becomes quite easier for the companies to commercially exploit the user data. Hence, because of these two reasons, the Supreme Court declared the Section 57 of the Aadhaar Act as unconstitutional. Now coming to the Aadhaar and Other Laws Amendment Bill passed by the Lok Sabha, this particular bill basically seeks to amend the Aadhaar Act, the Telegraph Act 1885 and Prevention of Money Laundering Act 2002. An amendment of these acts would enable the individuals to voluntarily share their Aadhaar details with banks as well as the telecommunication companies. So by voluntarily sharing their Aadhaar details, the individuals will be able to link their Aadhaar card details with the mobile number as well as the bank accounts. Now this article here highlights that passage of this bill by the Lok Sabha goes against the Supreme Court judgment which had struck down the Section 57 of the Aadhaar Act as unconstitutional. In this regard, this particular article here has raised certain concerns with respect to this particular bill. Let us understand the concerns raised in this particular article. Now this particular bill provides for the identification of the customers by the telecommunication companies and the banks in mainly four different ways. And these four different ways are the online and offline authentication by using the Aadhaar details, use of passport or any other officially valid document which will be notified by the government. So the telecommunication companies and the banks can use these four methods in order to authenticate their customers. However, this particular article here suggests that if the government fails to notify any officially valid document for undertaking the authentication process, then in such cases, Aadhaar, which is supposed to be voluntary, can actually become compulsory. This is because the majority Indians do not have the passport. So if the government fails to notify any officially valid document, the Aadhaar can actually become compulsory for the customers. And this would lead to the commercial exploitation of the user data by the companies, and it also impinges on the fundamental right to privacy of the Indian citizens. So the author of this particular article is highlighting that Aadhaar, which is supposed to be voluntary, can become compulsory by default. And this would go against the Supreme Court judgment on Aadhaar. Further, this particular article highlights that the bill passed by the Lok Sabha has diluted the Supreme Court judgment with respect to Section 33, Clause 2 of the Aadhaar Act. So let us understand as to what exactly is this Section 33, Clause 2 and how this Section 33 has been diluted under the present bill. Now if you look at the original form of the Section 33, Clause 2, the main intention behind this particular section is to ensure the data sanctity of the Aadhaar information. So this particular section provides that the Aadhaar information can be disclosed only upon a direction received from the Joint Secretary to the Government of India, and such a direction from the Joint Secretary can be based only in case of a national security. So in matters related to national security, the Joint Secretary of the Government of India can direct that the Aadhaar details should be disclosed. Now with respect to Section 33, the Supreme Court had ruled that the disclosure should be based upon the request of a higher ranking officer who may be a secretary to the Government of India. And in order to ensure that this disclosure is fail-proof and transparent, the Supreme Court has stated that this process should also involve a judicial scrutiny by a judicial officer who may be a sitting judge of a high court. So the disclosure of Aadhaar details can take place based upon the request of a higher ranking officer, that is preferably a secretary, along with the judicial scrutiny by a sitting judge of High Court. However, if you look at the amendment passed by the Lok Sabha has accordingly taken the Supreme Court's first concerns into account by substituting the Joint Secretary with the Secretary. However, the second concern of the Supreme Court with respect to judicial scrutiny has not been provided under the amendment. Hence, in this regard, this article has highlighted that the amendment has disregarded the Supreme Court judgment with respect to the judicial scrutiny. So these are the two main concerns highlighted in this article with respect to the recent bill passed by the Lok Sabha. And accordingly, the article has argued that the Rajya Sabha has to reject this particular bill since it goes against the Supreme Court judgment on Aadhaar. So, based upon our discussion, a main question for your practice would be the Aadhaar and Other Laws Amendment Bill 2018 passed by the Lok Sabha goes against the Supreme Court judgment which had declared Section 57 of the Aadhaar Act as unconstitutional. Discuss. Now you can try writing answer to this particular question based upon our video analysis. So having analyzed all the aspects related to this particular article, let us now move to the next article. Now the next article appears as an editorial on page number 8. It also appears on page number 1. Now this particular article has appeared in the newspaper because recently the Union Cabinet decided to provide for reservation for the economically weaker sections of the Indian citizens. Accordingly, this particular constitutional amendment bill was introduced in the Lok Sabha. And as the article here highlights, this particular constitutional amendment bill has been passed by the Lok Sabha with a special majority. Now, this particular aspect of the bill, which provides for the reservation for the economically weaker sections, has been comprehensively been covered in our DNS dated 8th of Jan 2019 by Navid sir. Hence, we will not be going into details of this particular bill. However, this particular editorial here has highlighted certain concerns with the government reservation policy. Hence, as part of this video analysis, we look into certain concerns raised in this particular article with respect to government's proposal for providing reservation to the economically weaker sections. Now, this particular editorial here highlights that the constitutional amendment bill passed by the Lok Sabha may not stand the judicial scrutiny since it goes against the 9-judge constitutional bench of the Supreme Court in the famous Indira Sawhney case. It is to be remembered here that in the Indira Sawhney case, the Supreme Court had stated that the overall reservation with respect to jobs as well as the educational institutions should not exceed the limit of 50%. Apart from putting a cap on the amount of reservation, the Supreme Court has also stated that for giving reservation to any community, economic backwardness cannot be considered to be a sole criteria. The economic backwardness can be considered as a criteria for providing reservation only if it is considered along with social backwardness. So as you can see here, according to the Supreme Court judgment, the primary criteria for providing reservation should be the social backwardness, and the economic backwardness cannot be the sole criteria. However, if you look at the bill passed by the Lok Sabha, the bill has taken into account economic backwardness of the citizens as a sole criteria for providing the reservation. Hence, because of these two reasons, the editorial here highlights that the constitutional amendment bill passed by the Lok Sabha may not stand the judicial scrutiny. Apart from the Indira Sawhney case, the Supreme Court of India in the M. Nagaraj case held that equality shall be considered to be a basic structure of the Indian Constitution, and this equality is ensured through putting a limit on the reservation. Now, putting a limit on the reservation ensures equality of opportunities for all the communities. So, the Supreme Court of India had stated that the 50% ceiling is a constitutional requirement without which the structure of equality of opportunity would collapse. In this regard, this particular editorial here highlights that this particular issue related to equality may be raised in a court of law on exceeding the amount of reservation being given to the people. Further, if one looks at Article 16 Clause 4 of the Indian Constitution, this particular article provides for reservation in the favor of any backward class of citizens. However, the reservation can be provided to the backward class of the citizens only when the government is of the opinion that a particular community of people is not given adequate amount of representation in the government or the public service. Which means to say that in order to provide reservation to any particular community or a class of citizens, the government has to show that this particular community is underrepresented in the government service. Now, this particular editorial here highlights that the government has gone on to provide for reservation for the economically backward class of citizens without showing any quantifiable data of their underrepresentation. Lastly, the reservations in India have traditionally been provided in order to undo the historical injustice and social exclusion suffered by the people over a period of time. So this particular editorial here highlights that if this particular bill comes up for judicial scrutiny, then the government would be required to prove that It aims to undo the historical injustice and social exclusion suffered by the economically backward class of citizens. One important aspect which has to be mentioned here is that the views expressed here are purely from the perspective of the editorial, wherein the editorial has expressed concerns with respect to reservation policy of the government. However, there can be viewpoints which are contrary to the points mentioned in this particular editorial. Since it is a developing story or a news in transition, let us wait and watch for the contradictory viewpoints to emerge. We would be discussing these points as and when they appear in the newspaper, and this would enable you to get a comprehensive understanding with respect to this particular issue. With this, let us now move to the next article. Now, this particular article appears on page number 6. The title of the article is Mixed Response to Scheduled Tribe Status to 6 Assam Groups. This article shall be important mainly from the perspective of prelims under the subsection Indian Polity. Now, this particular article has appeared in the newspaper because the Union Cabinet has recently decided to grant the Scheduled Tribe status to 6 communities in Assam. In this regard, the Union Cabinet is set to table the bill for granting the Scheduled Tribe status to these 6 communities in the Parliament. Hence, from the prelims perspective, one would be required to understand as to what is the procedure for granting the Scheduled Tribe status to a particular community, and secondly, as to what characteristics are taken into account by the government for granting the Scheduled Tribe status to a community. Now, the procedure for granting the Scheduled Tribe status to a community in India has been provided under the Article 342 of the Indian Constitution. Now, Article 342 provides that any initial declaration of the communities as scheduled tribes shall be done by a presidential order, wherein the president shall declare the communities as scheduled tribes after consulting the state government. So once the initial declaration is made by the president, any subsequent inclusion or exclusion of communities from the scheduled tribe status can be done only through an act passed by the parliament. Hence, from the prelims perspective, what you are required to note here is that the initial declaration of the communities as scheduled tribe status is done by the president, wherein the subsequent inclusion or exclusion of the communities is to be done by an act of parliament. And as you can see the news here, the Union Cabinet has now decided to include the 6 communities as scheduled tribes. However, this decision of the Union Cabinet has to be ratified through an act of parliament. Now the question here is, based upon which characteristics a particular community can be declared as scheduled tribes. So some of the characteristics which are being taken into account for the declaration of scheduled tribes include the primitive traits of the people, the geographical isolation, the distinct culture of a community, if the community is shy of making contact with the community at large, or a community which is considered to be an economically backward. So based upon some of these characteristics, it may be decided to give a particular community the status of the scheduled tribe. Apart from that, from the prelims perspective, one should note that the administration and control of tribal areas in the 4 northeastern states of Assam, Meghalaya, Tripura and Mizoram has been provided in the 6th schedule of the Indian Constitution. However, the administration and management of tribal areas in the rest of India has been provided under the 5th schedule. Now, the reason for the categorization of these tribal groups is that the tribal groups living in the northeastern part of India have not assimilated the common way of life, and even today, some of the tribal communities have been considered to be anthropological specimens because of their unique customs and traditions. However, if one looks at the tribes living in the rest of India, they have assimilated the common way of life. Hence, the Indian Constitution recognizes the fact that the administration of tribal areas in the northeastern part of India should be different from the administration of tribal areas in rest of India. And accordingly, it provides for greater amount of autonomy to the tribal groups living in the 6 scheduled areas by setting up the district autonomous councils. So these are some of the important aspects which one must know with respect to this particular article from the prelims perspective. With respect to the discussion which we had so far, these 2 questions shall be a prelims question for the practice. Please pause this video and try to find answer to these 2 questions. We will be discussing the answer after 5 seconds. The question here is, consider the following statements with respect to declaration of communities as scheduled tribes under the Indian Constitution. Now, the first statement reads as the initial declaration of communities as scheduled tribes can be done only through an act of parliament. Now, this particular statement here is wrong. This is because, as we have discussed, the initial declaration has to be done through a presidential order. Similarly, here, if you look at the second statement here is also wrong. This is because any subsequent inclusion or exclusion of communities has to be done only through an act of parliament. So, looking at the options here, the correct answer to this question is D. That is neither one nor two. Now, coming to second question here, the question is which among the following states are covered under the sixth schedule of the Indian Constitution? As we have discussed, the sixth schedule of the Indian Constitution provides for the administration and management of tribal areas in the states of Assam, Meghalaya, Tripura, and Mizoram. So, looking at the options here, only option number 1 and 2 here are correct. Hence, the correct answer to this particular question is A, that is 1 and 2 only. Thus, having analyzed all the aspects related to this particular article, let us now move to the next article. Now, the next article appears as an editorial on page number 8. The title of the article is Reinstated Conditionally. This particular article shall be important from the perspective of GS Paper 2 Governance under the subsection Statutory, Regulatory and various quasi-judicial bodies. As you all know, recently the Director of CBI, Mr. Alok Verma, and the Special Director of CBI, Mr. Rakesh Asthana, were involved in a turf war wherein both these officers had traded corruption charges against each other. Subsequently, the Central Vigilance Commission, which has the superintendence over the CBI, took note of these corruption charges. Further, acting on these corruption charges, the Government of India sent both these officers, that is, the Director of CBI and the Special Director, on a leave and in turn appointed Mr. Nageshwar Rao as the interim CBI Director. Hence, in this regard, the CBI Director had filed a case before the Supreme Court against the decision of the government of sending him on a leave. So what has happened now is that the Supreme Court has reinstated Mr. Alok Verma as a CBI Director. And in order to reinstate the CBI Director, the Supreme Court relied on the principles laid down by it in the Vinit Narayan case. Now, it is to be remembered that in the Vinit Narayan case, the Supreme Court had stated that the appointment as well as the transfer of the CBI Director should be decided by a high-powered committee, and this high-powered committee should comprise of the Prime Minister, the Leader of Opposition in Lok Sabha, and the Chief Justice of India. So, important point to be noted here is that even the transfer of the CBI Director has to be decided by the high-powered committee only. However, the decision to send the CBI Director on leave was actually decided by the Cabinet Committee on Appointments and not by this high-powered committee. So, taking note of this particular action of the government, the Supreme Court ruled that the decision of the government to send the officer on a leave amounted to the transfer of the CBI Director, and this transfer has to be done only by the high-powered committee and cannot be undertaken by the Cabinet. Apart from that, by reinstating Alok Verma as CBI Director, the Supreme Court has stated that the CBI Director shall not be allowed to take any major policy decisions. Further, it has also asked the high-powered committee to look into the corruption charges presently investigated by the Central Vigilance Commission, and based upon these charges, the high-powered committee is required to take the future decision with respect to the CBI Director. Hence, in this regard, this particular news becomes a news in transition since the high-powered committee is yet to act on the corruption charges leveled against the CBI Director. Based upon our discussion, this would be a prelims question for the practice. Please pause this video and try to find answer to this question. We will be discussing the answer after 5 seconds. The question here is, who among the following are the members of the high-powered committee for the appointment and transfer of the CBI Director? The first option is Prime Minister, the second option is Home Minister, and the third option is Leader of Opposition in Lok Sabha. As we have discussed, the high-powered committee comprises of the Prime Minister, Leader of Opposition in Lok Sabha, and the Chief Justice of India. Hence, Home Minister is not part of the high-powered committee. So, looking at the options here, the correct answer to this question is C, that is 1 and 3 only. With this, let us now move to the next article. Now, the next article appears on page number 10. The title of the article is Lok Sabha passes the DNA technology bill. This article shall be important from the perspective of GS paper 2 governance. As the title of the article here highlights that the Lok Sabha has passed the DNA technology bill. Hence, as part of this video analysis, let us first understand the purpose behind the passage of the DNA technology bill and some important provisions of this particular bill. As you all know, the DNA of a person is unique and variation in the sequence of a DNA can be used to match individuals and identify them. Because of this, the DNA technology can help us in both criminal investigation as well as civil matters. Now, with respect to criminal investigation, the identity of a criminal offender may be determined by matching the DNA found at the crime scene with the DNA of a suspect. Similarly, with respect to civil matters, the DNA technology can be used to resolve the disputes related to parentage. However, in spite of the advantages of adoption of DNA technology, the use of DNA technology is presently not regulated in India. Hence, in this regard, the DNA technology allows for a regulated use of the genetic information, that is the DNA, in order to establish the identity of the persons. Now coming to important provisions of the DNA technology bill. Now this particular bill provides that the DNA data can be used for only those matters which are listed in the schedule of the bill, and some of the important matters which are listed in this schedule of the bill include the offences covered under the Indian Penal Code, the disputes related to paternity suits, as well as to identify the abandoned children. And with respect to the permission required for the collection of DNA data, the bill states that if a person is accused of any criminal offences for which the punishment is less than 7 years, under such cases, the enforcement authorities would be required to take the permission from the person to collect his DNA. However, if a person is accused of any offences whose punishment is more than 7 years, for example, the death punishment, in such cases, there is no need for the enforcement authorities to collect the DNA from such accused person. And in order to regulate the DNA technology, this particular bill sets up the DNA Regulatory Board, and this particular board shall be headed by Secretary, Department of Biotechnology. And with respect to storage of DNA data, this particular bill sets up a national DNA data bank as well as the regional DNA data bank. Now these two data banks shall receive the DNA data from the DNA laboratories scattered across India. Now, in spite of the advantages which can be attributed to the DNA technology, the DNA technology can actually be misused by the authorities in order to falsely implicate the innocents in certain offences. Hence, in this regard, there is a need to have a strong protection of the DNA data which is being stored in India. Hence, in this regard, this particular bill provides for the DNA data to be used only for the identification of the individuals. Further, it also states that the DNA Regulatory Board, headed by the Secretary in the Department of Biotechnology, would be supervising the DNA data banks. In order to further strengthen the DNA data protection regime, it provides for punishment for the misuse of the DNA data. For example, a person can be imprisoned if he is disclosing the DNA information with a malicious intent from the DNA data bank. Similarly, a person can also be imprisoned for the using DNA without any form of authorization from the DNA Regulatory Board. So these are some of the important provisions of the DNA technology bill. Apart from this, in our DNS dated 21st of December 2018, I have covered certain criticisms of the DNA technology bill. So please go through this particular DNS in order to understand certain concerns related to the DNA technology bill. Based upon the discussion which we had so far, this would be a prelims question for your practice. Please pause this video and try to find answer to this question. We will be discussing the answer after 5 seconds. The question here is, consider the following statements related to the DNA technology bill. The first statement here is, it enables the use of DNA technology only for the criminal investigations. Now this particular statement here is wrong. This is because under the DNA technology bill, the DNA technology can also be used for civil matters such as to solve parentage related issues. The second statement reads as, it provides that the DNA can be collected only with the prior consent of the individual. Now this particular statement here is also wrong. This is because, as we have discussed under the DNA technology bill, for certain offences such as the death penalty, there is no need to take prior permission for the collection of DNA from the accused. Hence, looking at the options here, the correct answer to this question here is D, that is neither 1 nor 2. So having analyzed all the aspects related to this particular article, let us now move to the next article. Now this particular article appears on page number 18. The title of the article is NASA's probe discovers a new planet. This article shall be important mainly from the perspective of prelims under the subsection Current Events of International Importance. In April 2018, NASA had launched a space mission known as the Transiting Exoplanet Survey Satellite. Now this particular satellite here is basically a space telescope which has been designed to discover the exoplanets which orbit around the bright stars. Now the exoplanets are the planets which are found outside the solar system. And this particular article has appeared in the newspaper because the Transiting Exoplanet Survey Satellite has discovered a new exoplanet known as the HD 21749. This particular exoplanet has been found in a constellation known as the Reticulum. Now why this particular space mission becomes important is because if you look at the previous year prelims questions, some of the important space missions of the world have been asked in the UPSC prelims. It is in this regard that Transiting Exoplanet Survey Satellite becomes important from the prelims perspective. With this, let us now move to the next article. Now the next article appears on page number 1. This particular article has appeared in the newspaper in the context of the passage of Citizenship Bill by the Lok Sabha. Now the various aspects of the Citizenship Bill has been covered in our DNS dated 1st of August 2018. So please go through this particular DNS in order to know various aspects related to the Citizenship Bill. With this, we have come to end of today's discussion. Now let us look at the question for the day.